Today, I'm going to start by introducing Mayida Zaal. She joined us in Cohort 4. Mayida is an activist scholar committed to an anti-colonial stance in her research and in her teaching. An associate professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Montclair State University, she leads Red Hawk's Rising Teacher Academy, a grow your own partnership with Newark Public Schools and the American Federation of Teachers. The participatory action research collective she co-founded, Reclaiming Me, Muslim Educators, is leading the first national study of K-12 teachers in the US who identify as Muslim. The Spencer Foundation recently awarded her a large research grant on education in support of her study. Dr. Zaal serves on the editorial board of the Bank Street Occasional Paper series and on the AAUW's International Fellowship Selection Panel. She earned her BA from Rutgers University in Biological Sciences and Spanish, her MS in Educational Leadership from Bank Street College of Education, and her PhD in Urban Education from Graduate Center, CUNY. Mayida is also the fabulous mother to a wondrous and amazing 8-year-old daughter, Imani. So let's welcome Mayida to our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next on our panel, we have Edwin Mayorga, PhD Cohort 7. Edward is a parent, educator, activist, scholar, and associate professor of educational studies in Latin American Latin studies at Swarthmore College. Formerly a New York City elementary school teacher and member of the New York Collective of Radical Educators, NYCOR, Edwin is the director of the #Barrio Ed Project, a youth participatory action research collaborative, the Community School and Colleges Partnership Study, and the #Ethnic Studies PHL Curricular Database Project. Edwin teaches and writes about racial neoliberal urbanism, scholar activism, participatory action research, entre mundos, abolition, decolonization, critical racial ethnic studies, and teaching for racial economic justice and healing. So in case anyone is wondering why we invited him, now you know. He is a lead co-editor of the online journal #CritEdPoll, co-editor of the book, What's Race Got to Do with It? How Current School Reform Maintains Racial and Economic Inequality, and is working on his first book, which examines the intersection of racial capitalist urbanism and sobrevivencia in a New York City Latinx barrio and barrio education during the Bloomberg mayoralty. He is on the board of the National Latino Education Research and Policy Project, the Educational Law Center, PA-ELC, PA-ELC, I don't know what that stands for, Edwin, I'm sorry, and on the K-12 advisory of the Philadelphia Higher Education Network for Neighborhood Development. While committed to being an educator, scholar, activist, Edwin also seeks to be an engaged spouse and parent, and as a result is often found at local parks with his spouse, Jen, and their sons, Teo and Julian or Juju. Brian Jones. So let's welcome Edwin, thank you. Woo-hoo! Next on our panel is Brian Jones from Cohort 12. Brian is the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He has contributed chapters to several books, most recently, Black Lives Matter at School, an Uprising for Educational Justice, which will be available next month from Haymarket Books. His first book, The Tuskegee Student Revolt, Black Power on Booker T. Washington's campus, is under contract with NYU Press. Let's welcome Brian as well. Woo. So thank you, radical friends, for joining us for this conversation. A quick note about our structure. We're gonna have each of our friends answer the first question individually and our last question, but then they have each chosen a different question to answer, and we'll be asking each other these questions. Our idea is to have a informal conversation, and then we'll spend the last maybe 15 minutes with audience questions as well. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start with the first question. And Mayida, will start with you. Can you share a story about how an experience of praxis equaling action plus reflection of love, one that you may have witnessed, enacted, or shared, has fueled your work and journey in education?
Thank you, Lizette. And thanks everyone for attending this conversation today. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts and questions too, as we're all sharing here. So I started school in Paterson, New Jersey in the 3rd grade, and I came to the mainland, I'll say, United States, as an immigrant child who migrated from Colombia to a Palestinian father and a Colombian mother. And as the youngest of 5 children, we moved to Puerto Rico, from Puerto Rico to Paterson. And as one can imagine, or maybe you can't, but the transition from Puerto Rico to Paterson was an incredibly difficult one for us, for our family, for lots of different reasons. Firstly, because we were here because my father had a medical crisis and needed to have open heart surgery at Columbia University. And to come from an island where we were embraced and loved by our community and move to a really stark kind of part of the city that at the time felt really stark to me as an 8-year-old, was really tough. And so I was in the public schools in Paterson from 3rd grade through 12th grade. And during that time, I had one Black teacher, not a single Latinx teacher. And I have to credit Rita Coley and her work, and in one of her workshops where she asks people to stand up, and if you've had one Black teacher or teacher of color, and stay standing if you've had 2, and so forth, right? And I sat down after the first one. I've thought a lot about Shirley and Jesse Dale, who were a couple, and Mrs. Dale was the librarian of my elementary school. And she spent a lot of time supporting me and coaching me through what it meant to be in this new world that felt really cold and distant for me, by helping me connect to books, but also by helping me connect to her. And when I graduated 8th grade, she handed me off to Mr. Dale, and Mr. Dale was the school, the dean of students at John F. Kennedy High School. And this was during the Lean On Me era of Joe Clark at Eastside High School, and I was in the other school in town at Kennedy High School. So just imagine what that must have looked like to then have, all white teachers. And thankfully I was the beneficiary of the young Stan Karp as an English teacher in the classroom as well. But Mr. and Mrs. Dale, who weren't teaching me directly, had such a significant influence on the way that I thought about how you embrace students, how you create an ethic of care, how you engage the community, and how you share resources and cultural capital in a way that I think really changed the way that I thought about education. And so that has really fueled my work and my journey in education. I mean, I think I've had a lot of other mentors since who've influenced me and have supported my work, and whose shoulders I stand. But I think of them a lot, and they're 2 people that I credit.
Nice, thank you for that, Maji. Next, we'll go to Edwin.
Hey, everyone. So the question then for me is, how does a praxis of love in my work, or how do I practice a praxis of love in my work and in my own learning? I did actually also want to take a moment this morning, actually speaking about Rita Coley, a student of hers and a friend of mine passed away yesterday. Her name was Margarita Vizcara, and she was a collaborator with myself and Alejandro Carrion we were working on a project, actually, an article that has everything to do with a lot of what we're talking about today. And so just wanted to take a moment to recognizing her as a young emerging scholar, and who was certainly gone too soon. And so just wanted to let people know that she's also just kind of, I'm sitting with that and trying to think about this. And I think ever more so, actually, her experiences and struggles that I came to know through her work have everything to do, I think, with understanding the ways in which racial capitalism and its circuitry seems to circulate in all aspects of education, including graduate doctoral level education, and what kinds of harm and trauma it triggers, but also the kinds of generational harm and trauma that we bring with us into educational experiences and classrooms. And so for me, the practice of love is what I describe in my work as the antidote or part of the antidote to racial capitalism and its logics and its heinous effects, which is race radicalism. And that draws from most directly from the work of the Black radical tradition and Cedric Robinson, and many others who have since taken up the mantle of the Black radical tradition, and by extension, notions of race radicalism. And what I mean by that, and a lot of my thinking lately has been focused on the ways in which, particularly our experience and our existence right now within the context of the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and structural racism, lest we forget the unfettered impact of capitalism and environmental degradation, climate devastation, and what this requires of us as educators, scholars, teachers, activists, parents, loved ones. This is spirit work for me, but one that's deeply material in how I proceed. And so how do we, as our teacher, Michelle Fine, reminds us, how do we kind of keep these critical bifocals on in which we are tending to our loved ones, our relationships, and the kind of interpersonal things on the ground and individuals, but also maintaining an eye on the structures of injustice that face us every day. And so I think for me, it truly is a praxis, one that's involved, that's deeply loving in a theoretical, kind of spiritual, ecological sense, a kind of universal sense, at the same time that it's very practical, that this work is small, loving work. It's the work for me that I do in my own teaching, the classroom, even focusing on trying to decenter our kind of, or let me say it this way, it's like decentering the expectations of academia, and centering the needs of humanity, the needs of the earth, as the priority. That these are what Bettina Love talks about as our kind of, what are our North Stars? And that our North Star, for me, those North Stars are each other and this world, because this is the only things we've got. And so I try to practice that in my research, in my writing, who I center, how I approach my research, particularly in a participatory action research, Entre Mundos, or a par Entre Mundos approach. Shout out to Dr. Jen Avila and company, who I've also been so deeply affected by urban education and the CUNY Graduate Center. But really thinking about those kinds of things then in participatory and liberatory ways. That's how I try to build my classroom. That's how I try to engage in my research. And I'm increasingly trying to think about what that looks like in terms of writing. And that writing is not just, formal peer-reviewed articles, but the whole host of ways that we engage and communicate and teach the public. And that I deeply am committed to a just kind of public, a loving public. So really thinking about, I'm really, I don't think I mentioned this in my bio, but I also do podcast work, invite my students to learn about how to write op-eds, think about comics. The journal that we've established is open access and online, and we're about to launch or publish our next upcoming issue, which is under the theme, taking from Saidiya Hartman, the idea of beautiful experiments, and engaging in a kind of politics intellectually that disrupts these kinds of traditional notions of expression and research and scholarship. So we have a number of zines and a comic alongside traditional academic papers, but each of them beautiful experiments onto their own. And that to me is an example of a practice of love that that I'm engaged in, and that I invite others to walk alongside with me. Yeah, so I think that's really what I've been focused on in a lot of different ways, even before the pandemic, but even more so, I feel like I've been doubling down on that now.
Thank you for that, Edwin, and thank you for sharing the sad news. Please send and share collective condolence.
Thanks, Lizette.
So Brian, you're up next. Should I repeat the question or you have it?
Sure. I kind of lost track of which question we're at. I think we jumped.
We're still on the first one, so we're good. Basically, everyone's sharing a story about how an experience of praxis, in which we're defining as action plus reflection of love, one that you may have witnessed, enacted, shared, has fueled your work and journey in education.
Oh, well, on that, and by the way, thank you, Lizette and Elisa, for organizing this, and Mayida and Edwin for being here. I just want to say at the outset, it's really nice to be here at the Graduate Center, even virtually. I find that anytime I engage, like as an alum, anytime I engage with this community, even if it's a Friday night dance party, I always learn something. I think the story that comes most readily to mind is the pandemic itself and the reaction of educators. I have to say both of my children's teachers, the teachers I work with at the Schomburg Center and our youth programs, what was remarkable to me about their reaction in the spring was the way in which all of the kind of crap of education fell away and was allowed, a lot of it was allowed to just fall away. Like suddenly it was all gone and nobody cared. And there was no enforcement of things that we had tried to stop for so long, like regents, and standardized tests and stupid things. And then suddenly, and I know that this isn't everybody's story. This is purely what I experienced and feel really fortunate to have experienced, was educators who really leaned into the humanity of the relationship with their students and trying to be a social lifeline to connect to their students and take the experience of the pandemic itself with all of its horrors and layers and the differences of experience of it itself as an object of study, as something that had to be looked at and thought about. And for many teachers, that meant also opening up radical possibilities of ways of understanding what it meant, which I was also really impressed and inspired by. So that leaves me with the kind of hopeful feeling that the best aspirations of our species, the best within us, we have lots of examples of the worst, but that there's something dormant between us that can, in bad times, actually shine. And that gives me hope that we can reorganize our world.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for kicking off our first round and letting us know a little bit about yourselves and where your work is grounded and has started for you. So we're going to begin with the first round of questions, and we'll see how many rounds of the questions we'll get with the time that we have. Mayida, I can't remember if you wanted me to start with number 2 or number 7.
Oh, 2.
2, great.
Sure.
So, and we'll give each panelist maybe 2 minutes, and I'll give, if it gets to 2 minutes, I'll chat you a 30-second timing, if that's okay, if you're able to see your chat. Okay, so Mayida, what has undoing racial capitalism meant to you in your life and in your research?
Thank you for that question, Lizette. So for me, it raises a lot more questions about what we value as a society, and what I value, what we value as an educational community. Questions about knowledge, whose knowledge, right? But also materiality. Like, what are the material consequences of many of the decisions that we make for people who have not had access to these institutions? So I'm thinking specifically about doing this work in the context of an academic position, in the context of a university. And so what, to reference back to what Edwin said earlier about the decentering the institution, right? And so for me, a lot of where I am right now in terms of thinking about how I'm doing my work is that first and foremost, I have to think about decolonizing my own mind, and decolonizing my own mind to the extent that not only am I prioritizing people in my life and my family, and that's something that I've always done. And that's why I started with the story about Mr. and Mrs. Zaal, who really taught me to do that early on, but also because, and not seeing that as an alternative, as something that we have, like, that in itself shouldn't be radical, right? That in itself shouldn't be that we have to take this extra step and step outside of these unrealistic expectations that the academy sets up for us to then have to work in the margins, et cetera. But the reality is that these academic institutions weren't built for people like me. They weren't built for women. They weren't built for people of color. They weren't built for folks in the LGBTQ community. They were built for white, wealthy men. And so there are so many assumptions that are made along the way as we think about, and that was my 2-minute timer, there's so many assumptions that are made along the way when we think about academic institutions and the academic trajectory that gets set up for folks. Whether, I mean, just a concrete example, right? So ever since I could remember when I became a teacher, I've always been involved in the summer hustle, right? How do we make up the difference for being a 10-month salaried employee? And in my position and in many academic positions, the expectation is that one does 40% research, 40% teaching, and 20% service. And that 40% research you find your own time to do, and that usually in the summer. But that assumes that you have the material resources to do that kind of work in the summer, and that you're not doing 3 or 4 other jobs to try to make up the difference and make ends meet. So, that's one of those kinds of obviously conversations that we can continue, and I'll pause there so my colleagues can also share their thoughts about their questions.
Yeah, and I think I'll give you a 1-minute warning because I feel like the 2 minutes and 30 seconds is just too short. But I tend to set my timer after. I didn't know you were setting a timer, Maji. That's great. All right. So Maji, would you go ahead and kick off the next questions?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So this question is for Brian. So Brian, how are you doing racial justice work in your professional life today?
Okay. Well, there's lots of things that I'm trying to do that I hope contribute to justice in a broader sense. And I'm feeling these days really both unsure about how we accomplish the bigger changes that feel more and more urgently necessary for us on this planet. And feeling fortunate that I'm working at a Black History research library and an enormous archive where if you are curious or kind of curious-minded, you are a kid in a candy store. So I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to try to stay curious in my job, learn as much as I can, rethink my assumptions about things like racism and capitalism, or as people say, racial capitalism. What is that? How does it work? What can we learn from Black history as we try to go forward and change the world as it needs to be changed? I am in a stance right now and in a place where I'm trying to, for myself and people around me, create opportunities to ask those questions, to dig into new possibilities that I had not considered previously, to give a platform to activists who are developing their own answers to those questions. But of course, the thing that's most immediately at hand for me, that I have hands-on levers to do, is to be of service to teachers. And as a former New York City public school teacher myself, I know that I went to, I had zero professional development or opportunity to learn Black radical history, or to anybody trying to help me figure out how to bring it to my students. So I can actually do that. That's something I can do. I can reach into the archives and pull out stories of organizing, of activism, of radical history that's largely hidden from us, and find ways to make it and set it up on a platter for teachers to take and bring to their students. And so I'm developing ways of doing that in workshops and curriculum projects and summer institutes. So, send me, I'll put my email in the chat, just write to me and say, Brian, I want to be on your listserv, and I'll send you everything that I'm doing as it rolls out. But that's really my object, is to use the tools that are at my disposal to make these resources as widely as available as possible, and to create space and open up spaces for a much broader range of conversations than I was ever encouraged to open up in classrooms, helped to open up in classrooms, and to lead and guide. So, school is this weird institution where we have opportunities to do things like this that you really don't have in any other kind of workplace or institution. So I'm trying to take full advantage of it to the best of my ability. And along the way, I feel, as I said, very lucky to be also in a mode of learning and trying to stay curious and trying to read as much as possible.
Yes, thank you for that, Brian. And I love that Edwin put in the chat that you're really talking about what it means to be a researcher, educator, accomplice, right? Excellent example of that from really all of our panelists here today, but thank you for that. So Brian, would you mind asking Edwin his question?
Yes, sorry.
No, it's okay. And I'm gonna leave my mic on just so you can hear my timer, because I've been turning it off. So the first bing is 2 minutes have passed and you have 1 minute left.
So Edwin, you spoke to this some before, so maybe you want to remix this question or add on to it, but how do you practice a praxis of love in your work and in your own learning?
Yeah, no, I think, I started to answer that one in my previous comments, but I actually wanted to go back to a question that you posed in your comments, Brian, and that I think Mayida was also pointing to, which is understanding what racial capitalism even is. And I've spent, I spent a lot of my work with Jean Anyon thinking about the political economy. And I'm excited to share, under the guidance of Jeremy Benson and Tom Padroni, Jeremy Benson being another Cohort 7 member of our lovely program, but a Teachers College record special issue in tribute to Jean Anyon. And in the piece that I work on there, I'm really, in a loving way, trying to extend what Jean Anyon was thinking about with her work as an activist and as a scholar, in how she stormed away at the political economy, at capitalism, and the ways in which it was harming everyone. And the way I was trying to build from that in this article and in my own work is really to think about the inextricable ways in which racism is bound to capital. And as such, the argument that all capitalism is racial capitalism at this particular conjuncture in which we're living in, and historically, as Cedric Robinson has shown us, and that they are intertwined, but also productive of each other, rather than, race being nested into capital or capitalism being nested into racism. And I don't pretend to have the definitive end all punto, definition of it, but this is my kind of working understanding of it. And so again, I think the quick response is how do we respond to the circuitry of dispossession of racial capitalism? And as I was saying, I think engaging in this kind of race radicalism, and one of the things that I'm working on right now actually is what I talk about as the school community nexus. So the kind of complicated ecosystems of schools that schools are a part of, but that do not end at the walls of the school, but actually extend into the communities and families in which the schools find themselves geolocated in. And so doing that work here in Philadelphia, but I think it applies, in many places. We see this kind of growth in community schools or these other kinds of wraparound services. All of this I'm saying to suggest that often racial capitalism is really good at co-opting these really wonderful sounding things. I see the same thing with restorative justice being kind of like co-opted, and the soul and kind of spirit of the loving spirit of each of these ideas, revolutionary ideas, have get undermined by that. And so what I'm really interested in thinking about is how do we document and amplify the way people on the ground actually put the love back into these and kind of anti-capitalist, anti-racist love back into these projects. And one of the schools that I'm really delighted to be in partnership and in collaboration with here is Kensington Health Sciences Academy in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia. And really, I'm just kind of inspired to see a school leader, a cadre of teachers, a group of parents and young people all like rowing together in the same direction and loving each other in a way that is inspiring. We certainly don't see it in the report card scores, and like test scores, but I see it in the transformative young people that this school is producing, or taking part and contributing to in their formation, because they brought their brilliance. It's just the school and that school community provide an opportunity for that brilliance to shine. And to see these teachers do this in the midst of a pandemic is, just kind of like the most loving kind of public version of justice that I've seen in quite some time.
Yeah, thank you for that, Edwin. And I'm sorry for the timer. I think Elisa and I will think of restructuring this differently for the next one, because you all have so many wonderful things to say. It doesn't seem right to cut you all off. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move to our last round, because we do want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. And for this last round, you have 2 minutes to answer. And the last question is, we wanted to start with storytelling and end with storytelling. So can you please share a story of an experience, an interaction with another person, an event you participated in, or even a moment in your own personal life during the past few months when you have felt your own power in doing the work of racial justice in this unjust world? And so we'll go ahead and bring it back around to Mayida.
Thank you. So for me, I think the first thing that is really at the center of my mind right now is the work that we're doing, that Reclaiming Me is doing. So Reclaiming Muslim Educator, and we're a collective of 7 educators, and we're embarking on this national study to look at the experiences of Muslim American teachers in K-12 classrooms. So that's the study, right? But there's the community work that's gone into creating the idea and building the project, and what it's meant for us to get the validation and the support from the Spencer Foundation for this work moving forward has been really significant for us to kind of sit with and think about what it will allow us to do, the conversations it will allow us to have, the kinds of community dialogues that we anticipate having. So when we first envisioned this project, we thought, and I started bringing people together, inviting Muslim American educators to, they were all people that I knew, but they didn't know one another. So I was inviting them to my home to meet one another because they were all having conversations with each other about, or with me, about the kinds of things that they were encountering in their institutional spaces. And so I thought people really need to be talking to one another, right? That's something that I'm always so grateful to Michelle Fine for really showing us the way of always building community in that way. And so I started to do that, and lo and behold, we created this project. And so that was over 2.5 years ago. In February of 2018 was when we first met. And so our initial proposal for the research was, the plan was to go to 20 different locations around the country to conduct focus groups and interviews. And because we can't travel now because of the pandemic, we've decided to flip it. And instead at the end, we're still going to do those context specific locations, but we're going to return to those sites at the end of the study and run community dialogues. And what that, so as a group, what we've been able to imagine and envision what those community dialogues will look like is like completely, I mean, beyond any expectations that I've had or beyond anything that I could have done on my own. So I was sharing this with Patricia Kruger, who's here as well in the audience, about that actually for me, the pandemic, because of the privilege that I have, because I continue to get a paycheck every week, even though I don't physically report to work, because I'm able to have this incredibly privileged, quote unquote, academic life at home, the pandemic has actually brought for me a lot of peace and calm in the sense that I've been able to shut out the noise. And that, I like that. I think it was Brian who said, like, the crap of education fell away. I wrote that down. I was like, yeah, that's how I feel like. And, there's clearly a racial component to that. There's a gendered component to that, right? To the extent that people that, we work with try to be attentive to the way in which service falls more on women and the way service falls more on women of color, et cetera, right? All of that now takes a back seat. And so I get to go, wow, I can focus on research and I can focus on the students who are literally right in front of me on the screen, right? And so there's a way in which I can attend to those things differently. And so that's been, that has in itself felt like a place where I can try to create some justice and disrupt this fast moving train that wants to leave us behind anyway.
Thank you, Maji.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Edwin?
Yeah, yes to all of that, Maji. I think, what's interesting about the pandemic is that it, like I was saying in the chat, is it filters out stuff, right? It starts to force us to be more discerning about what matters and what doesn't. And in doing that, it also it helps us to discern what's wrong, like what is unjust, what is oppressive, and what people are so deeply entrenched. Some people and many of our structures are so deeply entrenched in trying to salvage right now. There's all of this, like my son's school, it's a mixed bag, right? And I think for many of us who are parents here or are teachers, as many of us are, you're seeing this mixed bag of what schools are trying to do right now. And it's Herculean work, don't get me wrong. But it also should force us to pause, and what schools I think aren't feeling like they have the luxury of doing, which is to ask what matters here. And so we're seeing this kind of like fetishization of normality, of normalcy, that we're all trying to get back to, which is, pardon my language, like that's bullshit. Like we cannot go back to that because it was unjust. It was oppressive. It was anti-Black. It was anti-poor. Like, why do we want to go back there? And so really thinking about what then is the opportunity here? What does this new kind of discernment enliven in us, allows us to move forward in? And I would say, like, one example, one kind of loving example that I've been seeing in Philadelphia in particular, but nationwide, is defund the police. What does an abolitionist call actually do? And I think, you know, the whole thing about like we're afraid of like abolition just means like we're going to dismantle and burn shit down. Quite the contrary. It's about salvaging this earth. And it's about caring for the people in the most loving and radical and active way, in order to imagine, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about, imagine and build freedom as a place. And so for me, like seeing the kind of young people here in Philadelphia rise and finding myself in trying to like, how do I accompany these movements, right? How do I become what Brian so beautifully described in your work that you described, Brian? You know, how do I stand alongside, walk alongside these folks who are the change? You know, it's just been inspiring, you know, trying to get police out of schools, defunding the police, all in the midst of the pandemic, and like people putting their lives on the line. You know, what more loving thing is that? You know, and all of that is abolition to me. I'm gonna stop talking. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. No, that was great. Again, we're gonna come up with a different structure. That was beautiful. I think there were so many wonderful sound bites in there that we're trying to capture in the chat. So thank you for sharing that. And Brian, will you close us out on this last question before we move to audience questions?
Sure, I'll be brief. Thanks to everything that Mayida and Edwin said. I'll take less than 2 minutes. Okay. Actually, when I started working at the Schomburg Center, I tried to make a regular practice of going down into the archives and just, you know, digging through boxes that looked interesting to me. And there's one box about from the Black Panther Party's archives. And I mean, literally, it's like my second week on the job. I pull out this document that's a letter from the Harlem Panthers to the Harlem community, announcing the existence of the organization, explaining that it comes from Alabama, from Lowndes County, and the SNCC organized attempt to create an independent political party and contest for power and voting rights in the Black Belt of Alabama, that's where the idea comes from. It goes through that, it's one page. And then it lands on, here's what we're gonna do in Harlem for you, school. We're going to change, we need to change these schools. These are racist schools. We have to change the leadership of the schools. We have to change the teachers in the schools, and we have to change what they teach. They don't teach Black history. And the letter is dated August 1966. Wikipedia and every other source you're gonna find will tell you that the Black Panther Party started in Oakland in October of that year. But there's always more to the story. And so often in Black history, that more to the story begins or ends or moves through school. It's amazing. Hi, sweetie. It's always a center of, it's a resource for organizing, or it's a site of contestation. And so that's the power of school as an institution, as this crucial node in our society, and its struggles, and particularly in the Black struggle, which the importance of which cannot be overstated in the United States of America. That's what like makes me wake up in the morning and try to figure out a new way to get at this. Sorry, I did take 2 minutes.
That's okay.
But yeah, I think there's exciting work ahead.
Thank you for that. Thank you for all of you for sharing your thoughts on this work and how you're engaged in it. And it was personally inspiring for me to hear. And I can only imagine for the audience. So, we'll take this time to ask questions. You can either unmute yourself and ask the question, you can type it in the chat, and either Lisa and I will read it out for you. So this is our time. We have about 6 minutes, so we'll try to get as many questions as possible. If people, I don't know, Lisa, can we stay on a little bit longer? If people can stay on, we'll keep it going for about another 10 minutes. If panelists need to leave though, we understand, because we did truncate it at 4 o'clock, so we do respect your time for that. But why don't we go ahead and start with any questions?
I guess I'll, if I may, thank you, panelists. Appreciate your work, appreciate your energy. And to that point, the energy is amazing. So I'm wondering next steps. I'm hearing consistently and throughout a running theme is that, there's no going back. There's new norms to be made here. There's new realities to be acknowledged and pursued and followed. There's plenty of venues and mechanisms by which we can now utilize this energy and harness it and curate it. So what's our laundry list? What's a laundry list of what needs to, K-12, K-16, K-20, that needs to be really focused on, right? In terms of these radical possibilities, what are some things that if we could limit it to maybe 3 or 4 things, where do we need to focus our energy and be strategic about these next few months, maybe in a year or so, because we know retrenchment is on its way. So how do we begin to focus our energy? Thanks, guys. Appreciate you all.
Brian, do you have a hard stop at 4? Do you want to take a stab at answering that?
I have a phone call that I will, I'll go until the phone rings. So let me take a stab. I would want to, listen to the people who right now have been at the forefront of organizing parents, organizing teachers, and look at their list of demands first before I kind of say, here's what you should fight for. But what I've been feeling about the schools in New York City for a long time is they're just deep inequality to begin with. And I've always felt that there's a way in which they standardize a kind of set of outcomes. Like, here's our Common Core set of standards for what everybody should know. But they don't impose the same kind of accountability for themselves. There's no Common Core set of standards for what everyone must have. Like, everybody must have a library with 20,000 books in it. As soon as you set that as the standard, then that puts the heat on them to come up with those books and to come up with those resources. But as soon as you prioritize the question of outcomes and say that's what we're going to do to improve schooling is insist on all of these outcomes, then obviously it's a way of evading the responsibility of leaders to set up great schools for all kids. And so, I think right now we see young people in the lead. Teens Take Charge is suing the Department of Education. Just Google Teens Take Charge and look at what they're demanding. They're demanding an end to the entrance exams, which is a way of filtering out Black and brown students from advanced placement schools. And I think ultimately, when you talk to them, they will say that we shouldn't have this incredible dramatic inequality between schools such that there's a few prized schools that people are struggling to get into. So I think, ways to aim our arrows at attacking that inequality would be a great place to start for my money. But of course, I want to listen to what others are saying. And thanks for having me. And I apologize if I have to.
No. Thank you for joining us. Mayida and Edwin, either of you want to chime in, and then maybe we'll have time, maybe just for one more question if someone has it. Otherwise, we'll close out.
Mayida, you want to go or?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to build off of what you were saying, Brian, the way I kind of think about what I was interpreting you saying, I actually start with the question, and I ask my students and I ask teachers, do the schools love you? Do our schools love us? And more often than not, the answer is no. And I start with that question because I'm trying to facilitate or to enliven a conversation about what would that look like? What is it that we actually need? To circle back to Al's question. And I think part of that, and one thing, I'll add here just quickly, is just that I think there's a lot of healing that we as educators, we need to understand our own traumas in order to grapple with how we are reproducing traumas in the young people that we are working with. And because we are also part of those institutions that don't love our children, particularly Black and brown children. So I think we need to start there. That's where I would start with the abolitionist work starts from within, is one of the entry points to me, Al, to your question. Maybe that would be item one on the thing in relation to, I think, what Brian is asking us to think about at the same time. But I'll stop there. Maji, you had some thoughts?
The only thought that I wanted to build on was there are some amazing organizations. So for example, as it relates to our work with Muslim American teachers, and Manar Hussein, who's also in the audience right now and is working with me on the project, has pointed me in the direction of this institute for, it's ISPU, I put it in the chat, ispu.org. It's the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and they're working on some really significant intersectional issues, but especially as it relates to the Muslim American communities and communities. I say that in plural intentionally because it's a really heterogeneous set of communities. And so the ISPU is looking at what's happening for Black Muslims, what's happening in terms of healthcare, where are people doing really significant work to lift up and address the kinds of pain that's being experienced. But then there's also a lot of work that ISPU will either offer on their website or point you to other organizations that are looking at the way in which anti-Blackness is playing out within Muslim communities, for example. So for us right now at the moment, and for me in particular, it's really about looking to the community-based organizations that have spent a long time looking at these intersectional conversations and how to not just connect and lift them up, but to really learn from what those folks are doing to try to inform our own practice.
Yes, thank you for that. So with that, looking at the time, we're at 4:01. I think that might be a good place to close unless someone had a burning question they wanted to ask, then put it in the chat or speak now. I'll do a less than 30-second wait time. Okay. With that, Elisa's gonna close us out. She put some stuff in the chat that she might have to point you to. And then I have one last announcement before we close out and say thank you to our wonderful, wonderful panelists for their time and their energy and their work, not just here in this panel, but out there in the world, inspiring other graduates of urban ed and the cohorts and the places where you teach. I'll send my thank you to Brian separately, but it was really just a beautiful thing to hear you all speak. Maji, you had a finger?
Yeah, I wanted to just say really quickly just about the GC and about urban ed specifically, because that was one of the things that we had wanted to talk about at the end. And I'm thinking about Cohort 20 and the heavy lift that they have, not getting a chance to meet one another and be in person with one another as they're struggling and wrestling through this work. But this has been my academic home and urban ed. And I think it's because of all the people who are on this call now, right? Who, for me, it was a very specific group of folks: Darla, Linville, Patricia Kruger, Jessica Ruglis, Liza, Lizette, Amy Moran. I know I'm forgetting somebody. And we were all together really pushing each other from day one. But then, our community, obviously, it is and continues to be much larger than that. but it was our connection to each other and our ability to support, and within the support is really about challenging. Not just the intellectual challenge, but the spiritual challenge to continue to work together, to disrupt and to try to nurture each other along the way. And so I just wanted to say how important of a space this is that you've all created today. And I'm really thrilled that we get to, celebrate the 20th anniversary, and that so much has happened since we started, those of us in Cohort 4, and and we can look back and really celebrate all that's been done to get us this far.
Can I just
I
add
think-
to that?
Yes, go
sorry.
ahead, Edwin.
Oh,
No, go ahead.
I mean, yes, Maji, like, yes to all of that. And I think I want to speak to many of us, both past and present, and students and community members. We all entered the academy and academia at different points. And we're in a time where the university as a concept is in precariousness, or some kind of great precarity. And that being a graduate student is daunting, and a lot of what Bettina Love talks about is spirit murdering is happening. And I want to lift that up, not to like re-traumatize anyone, but to honor, like, look at y'all, like, look at people doing the work in spite of that, and remembering that that power is in you, and that power is in that collectivity, that community that Mayida so lovingly spoke about. Tap into that. Don't let this pandemic, don't let being physically distant permit you to actually be socially distant or away from the kind of social solidarities that we so desperately need right now. Like, as Adrienne Marie Brown says, like, give yourself permission to grieve, but give yourself permission to heal, give yourself permission to be in community, because we are all we have. And so it's so important. And I too, warts and all, like, so deeply appreciate that I had been able to walk with so many of you along my path through this community and what Urban Ed has provided.
Thank you for that. And that's like a perfect segue. I was going to go last, but I think I'll let Elisa go last with this last announcement. This will be quick. I'm putting in here a link to the UE 2020 Racial Justice Student Fund. And the thing about this is that, funding a program or donating to a program is more than just giving money, because, one might think, well, what will my $20 do? But really it's about saying, I stand for this program. This program is wanted and needed. And every dollar that you give in is a vote for Urban Ed, right? When CUNY looks at, well, which programs are we gonna fund? Which ones are people really vying for and standing up for? Something like the UE 2020 Racial Justice Student Fund is one of those ways, right? When they see that people are giving in your $1, your $5, your $20, whatever you can give, you're not just giving money, you're giving a vote, and you're saying, we believe in Urban Ed, we stand for it. It's one of the reasons why public radio and public broadcasting is still around, right? Because people still give and say, no, don't you dare take it away, government. Don't you see us giving money? So we put the tiny URL in there. It's really easy. So if you're able to donate whatever you can, and with that, I'll send it off to Elisa to close us out.
So the very short last word, two things. Three things, sorry. One is, thank you, Mayida. Thank you, Brian, wherever you are on your phone call. Thank you, Edwin. And thank you, Lizette. Michelle Fine couldn't have said it better, for midwifing, for holding space in the chat. Oh my God, you are a brilliant moderator and teammate, and thank you. And the three of you, radical friends, you brought it today. You kicked this thing off. So the conversation, this is for all the rest of you. The conversation continues. This is only the beginning. We're going to do this once a month with different folks and different foci. And I put in the chat a link. I gave you all the heads up, the preview of the actual Zoom link, so you can register or just show up. And please continue on with us. And then the last thing is, a friend of mine who's not affiliated with Urban Ed, she had to leave early, but I invited a couple friends, and she came and she said to me, she private chatted me, she said, I can see why you picked this program. These are your people. You all are my people, and hopefully we're all each other's people. And that's what solidarity is about. So with love, critical love, the praxis of love, radical joy and justice, and keep the hope and the fight alive, because that's what we're doing every day.
Yeah, and we hope to see you in future panel series discussions.
December.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Lisa.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
You too. Yes.
Edwin, thank you so much. That was great. You all were great.